The rain lashed the prairie as James limped through the storm, soaked to the bone, only to find a fire lit, soup steaming, and his long-forgotten book laid gently on the table, open to a poem he hadn't read in 20 years. And beside it, her quiet eyes. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind tasted of dust and old regret as it curled around the brittle eaves of Willow Creek Station. Margaret Ellis stepped down from the train with nothing but a small trunk, a black hat pinned tight against the gusts, and hands that trembled not from fear, but from the absence of anything left to lose. She was 42 and had buried more than she'd built. Her hands, calloused from years of work that had gone unnoticed, clenched the letter he'd sent her. Not folded delicately, not sealed with care, but creased and utilitarian. Come quick. Marriage awaits. I expect no romance. Only work and silence. James Calder was waiting beneath the station awning, jaw like chiseled bark, and eyes that scanned her as one might assess a plow. He hadn't worn a coat, as if the cold should know better than to try him. His boots were caked in dry mud, his shirt clean but threadbare at the cuffs, and his stare hollow as winter earth. When he spoke, "You're not what I pictured." The words didn't sting so much as settle, like soot on already burned ground. Margaret didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to be pictured," she said. Not sharp, not soft, just fact. By the time the sun folded itself into the horizon, the deed was done. The preacher's blessing was swift, his wife's eyes apologetic. No hands were held, no promises spoken. The contract was plain. She would cook, clean, and carry the silence of his home. He would give her shelter, not warmth. She would not expect kindness, and he would not offer it. That first night, the guest bedroom smelled of cedar and old paint. A single iron bed, a basin with a crack down the side, and a curtain that didn't quite reach the floor. Margaret unpacked slowly, placing a tattered book on the nightstand, the only relic of a past life too quiet to mourn aloud. She moved like a ghost in her own skin, body still, mind braced. Outside, James slept in the barn, not from nobility but distance. A space drawn thick by history he refused to explain. The horses shifted. The rafters creaked. The night stretched thin between them, a thread pulled taut with expectation but frayed at every edge. They were husband and wife by law, strangers by choice and prisoners by necessity. And as that cold spring crept in, neither spoke of beginnings, only endurance. The days unfolded in silence, a silence not of peace but of something tightly coiled and unspoken. In the dim morning light, Margaret moved through the house like a whisper. Her presence felt more in what she touched than in what she said. The wooden floorboards knew her step. The kitchen stove warmed to her rhythm. She spoke to no one, least of all James. And yet nothing went untouched by her care. The shirts he left by the door, creased, dirtied, wrinkled with the long hours of land that refused to give, returned to his drawer clean, stitched, ironed, folded like a prayer never offered aloud. She did not smile, not even when she hummed. It was a low hum, aimless but steady, like the wind that rustled the dry cotton curtains or the hens murmuring in the coop. It wasn't joy. It was function, like everything else about her. James began to notice that she never asked for anything, never about the ranch, never about the past, never even why he wouldn't meet her eyes at supper. She was not meek. She was something worse. She was undemanding. It grated at him. One morning he passed her in the hall, she with a bundle of firewood in her arms, him with a limp from a stubborn fence post. Their shoulders brushed, and she gave a polite nod, as if they were mere boarders under the same roof. That was when the memory struck him. His late wife, Camille, never walked past him without perfume. Margaret smelled only of soap and cold air. That night, returning from the pasture, he caught sight of her beneath the porch's sagging edge. Lantern light spilled through the slats, catching the curve of her shoulders as she knelt over something curled and shivering. A fox cub, tiny and trembling, its hind legs splinted with strips of linen. "You feed it. It stays," he barked. His voice cracked the quiet like a whip. She looked up, not startled, not ashamed. Her hands didn't stop working. "Maybe that's what it needs," she replied. Not a challenge, not a plea, just a truth offered gently. For a long breath, neither moved. Then he turned, muttering something half-formed, and walked into the dark. The next morning, the fox was gone. But the coffee on the kitchen table was hot, strong, and prepared just the way he hadn't realized he liked it. The rain had come down like judgment, sheeting across the prairie in slanted torrents that bent fence posts and turned dust to mud. James staggered through it long after the sun had vanished, boots sinking, leg dragging from a twisted ankle earned in the fight to save a gate from snapping clean off its hinges. By the time he limped to the porch, the storm had eased, but he was soaked through, chilled to the bone, and too proud to call it pain. The door creaked open before he reached it. Margaret stood in the entry, her face unreadable in the lantern's glow. She said nothing, just stepped aside. The room was already warm. The hearth crackled with fresh-cut wood. The floor swept clean, and on the table, steam curled from a bowl of soup beside a folded towel and a cup of tea that hadn't yet gone cold. He didn't thank her. Not properly. Just a grunt, a nod, a heavy lowering into the chair like a man twice his age. But he didn't retreat. Not right away. That's when she handed him the book. Slender, dusty, leather-worn with time. He stared at it like it was a ghost. "I saw your name in the front," she said, settling into the chair opposite, hands still smelling faintly of soap and bread dough. "Didn't peg you for a poet." His throat tightened, and he said nothing. The book had belonged to a younger version of him, one who scribbled in margins and underlined words like solace and hollow. A version buried beneath debt and death and 17 years of loneliness disguised as labor. They sat there for a while, not as strangers, not yet as friends, something in between, a space soft enough to feel unfamiliar. He flipped the book open, pages thumbing with memory. She didn't intrude, just watched him the way one might study a man remembering his own name. And in the days that followed, the silence between them changed its shape. She asked questions, not many, but ones that mattered. Not the ones neighbors gossiped about, but the ones only someone patient would think to ask. About the fox, about the trees behind the barn, about the wife who had smiled in photographs but never in the kitchen. Margaret didn't offer pity, she gave attention. One night, without ceremony, a quilt appeared at the foot of his bed. Patchwork from old fabric. A cuff he vaguely remembered from a lost flannel, the faded blue of what might have been his mother's apron. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. He didn't say anything, just sat on the edge of the mattress, fingers tracing seams. And after a while he pulled it over himself, as if it had always belonged there. The heat of summer came not with violence, but with gentleness. Warm earth, slow breezes, a sun that lingered just long enough to soften the world without scorching it. The land, once brittle and resentful, began to yield again, cautiously at first. Shoots of corn pushed through soil James had nearly given up on. The hens, stubborn and silent through spring, began to cluck with renewed purpose, their nests finally full. Life was not abundant, but it was returning, piece by piece. Inside the house, something quieter had begun to change. James caught himself standing longer at the threshold of the parlor, watching Margaret as she sewed near the window. Her needle moved steadily, pulling thread through faded cloth, shirts that had once belonged to men long buried or gone to other lives. Her hands were sure, and though she didn't hum as often now, the silence around her felt full, not empty. He didn't know when it started, this noticing. The way her fingers curled around a teacup, how she wiped her hands on her apron before reaching for anything precious, the tilt of her head when she read, as if listening for the voice of the author. There was no moment of revelation, only a quiet accumulation, like rain filling a bucket drop by drop until it finally spills over. When talk of the county fair reached their porch, James said nothing. But on the morning of the event, he saddled the wagon without prompting. Margaret emerged in her Sunday dress, the one she rarely touched, blue-gray with a small white collar. She hadn't altered it, hadn't needed to. Her hair, pinned back with care, caught the sunlight like silver ribbon. They rode into town side by side, and by the time they stepped onto the fairgrounds, the hush had already begun to ripple. People watched. Whispers fluttered like moths around lanterns. James called her, the widower who'd married for convenience, who'd never danced since Camille, walked beside his wife with a stillness that spoke louder than pride. At the dance, he lingered near the wall, hands in pockets, boot heels scraping wood. Margaret stood alone for a while, content, watching the world pass. Then his hand found hers. "You don't have to," she said, not out of modesty but memory. "I know," he murmured. "I want to." They danced slow, as if learning together. Her palm fit in his like it had always belonged there. Around them, lanterns swayed gently, casting shadows that blurred past and present. "I married you for the land," James said quietly. "But you gave me a home." Margaret's breath caught, but she didn't cry for sadness. She cried because someone had finally seen her, truly, without pretense, without debt. "You never owed me love," she whispered. He shook his head, voice almost lost to the music. "I never expected to feel it again. But here it is." No one clapped. No one jeered. They only watched, reverent and still, as if love, real, unadorned, unasked for love, had returned to the prairie on silent feet.